MongoDB course and also Mongoose here soon. Just want to introduce you into it and tell you a little bit about it. So far we've learned about Node, we've learned Express, of course JavaScript initially, and we learned about sockets. And now we're going to be moving into learning about a data persistence, right? Which is going to be the database that we're going to be using with this stack. It's important to note that we could use any database. We don't have to use MongoDB as our database. We could use a SQL database. We could use a Postgres database. We could use a Redis database. It's irrelevant. We just chose to use a MongoDB database because MongoDB uses JavaScript-like objects to be stored inside of it. So essentially, the stack, you would be using JavaScript and JavaScript objects from all the way to the database, all the way out to the user, to the client side with Angular. It's all going to be JavaScript code or JavaScript objects being moved around. But for most applications in the industry, you will be leaning a lot on a SQL database. That said, a NoSQL database such as MongoDB is very useful for its own purposes, and we'll uncover that here. That's something you should pay attention a lot to, is understand when and why we would use a NoSQL database, what the advantages are, and when are good examples to use it. That's probably one of the most important pieces. Learning how to use MongoDB's shell and invoke commands so we can add objects in the database, retrieve objects, update and delete objects. With time and looking through and the assignments and completing them, that'll come fairly easy to you. Once we start learning later about MongoDB, which will be kind of what we call a middleware, it'll be the library that we're going to import in Express, and that library is going to be what's responsible to talk to MongoDB for us. So once we learn that, again, you'll see that the commands are fairly straightforward. You'll see the pattern, and in due time, I think that'll also become kind of second nature for you. But a lot of these pieces are probably fairly new to a lot of you, if not all of you that are watching this. So be patient with it. Take the time to understand them. Take down notes. That's a very big piece, and make sure you do a lot of repetitions. I think a big percentage of people out there do not have photographic memory. So you can't expect yourself to look at these commands one time and then try to write them over and over on your own without looking. So it's very important to take notes, keep them on the side. Every time you need to do X kind of command, you should look at the notes and see it and then type it out, right? Don't copy paste, but actually type it out to get used to these commands. But again, the most important pieces that I want you to pay attention to is why would you use a NoSQL database such as MongoDB and when it's the best purpose to use it, and then understand how to use the commands in the Mongo shell, which are important, and definitely later on understand how to use the commands with Mongoose. Understand the very fundamental commands with Mongoose, and know that if you ever need to find out more about Mongoose, I always recommend you to go to the Mongoose, documentation for Mongoose directly before you go to Stack Overflow and those other websites. The Mongoose documentation, thankfully, and great job to that team, is really good. They have really good documentation for Mongoose. So anytime you have a question or a challenge of like, well, how do I add something with Mongoose, or how do I add something with a Mongo shell? Go to the documentation first for Mongo, or go to the documentation for Mongoose and find those commands. Also, another thing to note is that when you go to those documentations, you will find a lot of additional pieces. I would urge you to understand the fundamentals first, get them down, and then later you can experiment in adding those additional pieces. Sure, a lot of full-fledged application developers that do Mongo and Mongoose for a living, they will use a lot of extra shortcuts and all these interesting, cool methods. But understand the fundamentals first, and then afterwards, it will be much easier for you to add the additional pieces. So Mongoose is a pretty fun track and stack, concept, and MongoDB, the database itself, it's actually pretty cool. So have fun with it. You could definitely use it for the wrong purposes, and you can use it for the right purposes, but it is definitely fun and fairly easy to use. So have a good time with it. Enjoy.